You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Andreas Petrosians. I'm the associate editor of e-flux Journal, and I'm really excited to be here today with Ciarán Finlayson, who's an editor from Houston, Texas. He's the author of Perpetual Slavery, out from Floating Opera Press in 2023, and the senior editor at Triple Canopy. Finlayson is on the core faculty of the Interdisciplinary Art and Theory program in New York, and has taught aesthetics and social theory at Columbia University, at the Sandberg Institute, and at Socialist Night Schools hosted by the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I guess let's just get right in and talk about your amazing new book, Perpetual Slavery. I'm going to start with a kind of a long question, but I think it'll give us some framing for this conversation because it's a small book, or appears small, but actually it's so full. It's always a lot to talk about. So you begin the book with the famous section from the last chapter of Capital Volume 1, where Marx lampoons imperialist political economy for thinking that capitalist social relations are transhistorical and also kind of like spatially omnipresent, rather than determined by a specific mode of production. So you also point to this infernal question, as you call it, of the historical transition signaled by emancipation in the U.S. context. And perhaps we'll get to this later more in detail when we discuss Saidiya Hartman and Du Bois, but I thought maybe we could start with two of the questions you posed in the very beginning of the introduction, where you ask, what is the bearing of the transatlantic slave trade on the present, and how can it be overcome? And what is the meaning of freedom in bourgeois society, and to what extent are we living in a post-emancipation world? So yeah, could you tease out some of the implications of these questions, and how you think art can be a meaningful lens through which to consider them?
Yeah, absolutely. One recent development is the kind of popularization of an idea of, say, the afterlife of slavery, which is a term that comes from Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, which is one of her more kind of like popular public-facing books, which has a kind of like metaphysical valence, but then it also kind of just describes something very practically, sociologically. So, there's just indexes in terms of lifespan and poverty and these other kind of just like social metrics. And it's like the consistent fact that Black people in the New World score lower on all these things is just like the simple index of, what we'd call or she would call like the afterlife of slavery, which I think it's very clear. And then you also have like Ava DuVernay's documentary at like 13th. It's now not so uncommon to think that the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery in America do have like a lot to do with very present-day laws and social formations. So obviously it's an idea that has much like longer history. I think now it's kind of being brought outside of maybe it's like social spaces organic to Black radicalism. So it's interesting to think about the afterlife of slavery on the one hand, and then Hartman has another term called she talks about the non-event of emancipation, which is something that is significantly like less popular. It's maybe a little bit slippery. But so there you can think about freedom and unfreedom in that sense. And then on the other hand, I think if one's interested in like the legacy of modern art, it's kind of constantly about the question of freedom. It's like art's own freedom, art's own autonomy, but also as like a register of social freedom. Or if you're an Adornian, the history of art and the history of bourgeois freedom have kind of everything to do with one another. And modernism is really registering, say, like the emancipation of the subject. But I think so there's a way in which when we're talking about, say, like either side of emancipation, or like when we're talking about freedom in bourgeois society, I think there can be a tendency to maybe reify the type of freedom that we're thinking of. And so in the book, I like use the term perpetual slavery, which comes from this Black abolitionist named James McCune Smith, who's writing in 1865, where he's the Civil War is like it's about to end. And he's got a very kind of sober analysis of it, where he says basically far from the end of the war emancipating people, what it will do is it'll emancipate capital. It'll emancipate capital's drive and capacity to own labor. And I think, so yeah, one thing that I think the title of the book does, like Perpetual Slavery, does like the condition that he talks about is as perpetual slavery is just the condition of capitalism. It's the transition from chattel slavery to wage slavery or something like that, which is like coming, I guess, yeah, even as like a very like 19th century idea coming from Black abolitionists then, I think is kind of like quite productive for thinking about the ways in which like our current society is like meaningfully unfree. Yeah, maybe I'll pause there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that already raises a lot of interesting questions, and maybe we'll get to this later, but in the section where you sort of introduce this term perpetual slavery, you also cite a labor anti-abolitionist from that period, and this like sort of like absurd argument that focuses only on this, let's say, like a certain sliver of material conditions to make a prognosis about the way sort of racialization and capitalist productivity relate to one another, and kind of shows that those kind of things die hard. Like, we're still dealing with those kind of debates. But yeah, to get back to this question of like the non-event of emancipation and these things, I think that, or maybe I'll let you say this, but I think the reason it's interesting to think about it from an aesthetic perspective is that aesthetics falls into similar debates about, are we looking at it from an ontologizing perspective or a metaphysical perspective, or are we looking at it materially? And those two things seem to be fundamentally at odds with each other. And similarly with this, if we think with Saidiya Hartman's work, and Scenes of Subjection, there's this question about like, what is the subject? How is the transition of subjecthood happening? So the book has two essays, one on the work of Ralph Lemon and one on the work of Cameron Rowland. And I thought maybe to start, could you say like why you chose to approach these questions through art, and specifically thinking about them with the art by these two artists?
Sure. So both of them are artists who are really dealing with making work about the present, but by means of kind of slavery and also kind of different stages of kind of post-emancipation society. So Ralph Lemon is a choreographer who spent most of his career making dance for stage, and eventually in the 2000s he kind of set that aside. He kind of thought this kind of like post-Judson style of dance was like a bit exhausted. Like postmodernism in dance really wasn't yielding much for him. So he decides to go on a long road trip through the South with his daughter to meet different people who, especially like older people who remember like much older forms of social dance. So he's, in his practice, he's using different like plantation dances, different blues dances, like all these types of things. But so he goes on this kind of, like a research mission basically. And he's visiting the Civil Rights Museum. And then eventually he meets in Little Yazoo, Mississippi, he meets a 90-year-old former sharecropper named Walter Carter. And Walter is this like bearer of history for him. He becomes, like in Lemon's own words, he becomes his own kind of like angel of history. And he's very inspired by Walter, and he decides to undertake this kind of like long set of collaborations with him. Sometimes he'll ask Walter to do dances. Walter is like quite old and frail. So when he's doing the old dances, mostly what he's doing is kind of like shuffling. So he's kind of like the bearer of this certain type of authentic Black agrarian cultural tradition, but then also the types of movements he's actually doing have maybe a lot more to do with the type of Judson-style performance that Lemon kind of comes out of. So he's kind of a way of merging these two traditions. And then on the other side of things, Rowland deals with kind of the legacy of slavery and its kind of like meaning in the present by way of ready-mades, by way of just kind of like very cold, kind of like mute sculptures and contract art. And so the most famous exhibition from Rowland being a show at Artist Spacetrum 2016 called 910-20,000. And the number is just, it's kind of a bureaucratic number that's been assigned to Artist Space through a government registry. Rowland has to register Artist Space as a nonprofit in order to be able to purchase prison-made commodities. And so a lot of the show is just these extremely plain objects that were made by prisoners paid little to nothing. They include firemen's jackets. They include rings used for leveling roads. They include just desks. They kind of include, and so the work is just kind of these plain things and then a few pieces of like contract art. And it's the contracts that really bring these contemporary objects made that year by prisoners, kind of like way back to say like the history of slavery, the history of the chain gang, like all these types of things.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. Like even thinking with Lemon, there were so many different sort of ways that you approach his practice. I mean, firstly, so you already alluded to this, but this ostensibly harsh break between producing Fluxus or Judson style dance scores, and then, as you say, I think in '95, he says, "From now on, I'm a conceptualist," which kind of actually reminds, I think, or at least me, of other sort of conceptualists like Marcel Brotard saying, I'm no longer a poet, I'm an artist now. Or, these sort of like obviously false things where you are sort of playing with the genres and conventions and modalities of production that exist within aesthetics. So that's one thing. I also thought it was really interesting how you point to how Lemon's scores point to a certain type of anti-work politics, which I think also make clear that there was always sort of maybe perhaps like a latent, if not explicit, anti-work politics that existed in, I'm thinking of people like Henry Flint or Stanley Brown or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, this all kind of comes back to your maybe recurring point in the book is that none of these things can be analyzed without an explicitly historical perspective or a certain type of historicity. Yeah, you already referred to Walter Benjamin. So I wonder if you could tease out how Ralph Lemon's works, specifically with Walter, with this former sharecropper, kind of act as, you call it, as his practice of search and transmission. So like allowing history to sort of speak as opposed to metaphysical or ontological definitions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's maybe two ways in which there's one is there's Lemon's own kind of engagement with history. He's doing a tremendous amount of reading about the civil rights movement. He's visiting civil rights museums. He's reading books about the history of social dance, but then he's also really going to far-flung locations, trying to track down the kind of like histories of Black social dance. And so for this thing that he calls the Dancing and Dying Tour, he is looking for the Delta bluesmen and the descendants of Delta bluesmen. And so he will he tries to find the families, and then he will play the music of the Delta blues musician for the families, usually in their living rooms, and he'll do dances for them that would have been like dances of the era. And at the same time, he's also looking for people who can teach him new dances, lost dances, things of that nature. So that's the dancing part of it. And then the dying part of it is he's doing research into lynchings. And for most lynchings, they're these kind of unmarked sites. So he'll find just a street lamp where somebody had been strung up, say in Minnesota. And he'll do these small, just dance for camera. No real audience except whoever happens to pass by. They're usually kind of quite minimal, or he'll lay down next to it, or he'll do maybe some of the very Walter style shuffling or these types of things, but probably movements that most people wouldn't even necessarily register as being a dance, but say he films these kind of counter memorial performances. So that's one level, but then I was also thinking in approaching the work of both artists, trying to bring a kind of historical materialist approach to the work that it's not necessarily the method that either of the artists is using, but it was one that I found productive. So through reading, Ralph Lemon is very interested in the Mississippi Delta, and Walter kind of is the bearer of this. Walter also is his own kind of historical repository. He drives around with Walter, and Walter will point out this was a Black-owned farm, this was a Black-owned farm. But then through the types of racial terror that Lemon is counter-memorializing, people are kind of dispossessed of these lands, but then also through overarching changes in the economy of the area. So for Ralph Lemon, I looked a lot at Clyde Woods, who wrote this book on the Mississippi Delta called Development Arrested. And one of Woods' insights is that there is a tendency in kind of the historiography of slavery in America to view American slavery as being somehow related to feudalism. And then also in the reading of sharecropping, it's also it's a remnant of an older mode of production. But what he does is he's looking kind of specifically at obviously after Reconstruction, but then also during the New Deal, he's looking at how the industry was industrialized and modernized, and then via that, how a lot of the people we think of as sharecroppers are functionally they're agricultural proletarians, which then kind of shapes how one looks at the forms of resistance that are available to them, their kind of general meaning within the context of resistance to capitalism in America. And he's also looking at really in a very specific way how say, New Deal funds were like withheld. So there were these kind of like bigger, maybe like universalist or like social democratic approaches to, like whatever, raising the conditions of like Black agrarian workers. And they were like scuttled through like really specific political machinations of the planter class, which I brought some of those details to bear because I think they help a bit with Lemon's project, because Lemon's quite, very self-consciously so, but quite romantic about the American South and about like what Walter like signifies and what he means. And there's a way in which I think objectively, like one kind of can't help but get this kind of affect from Walter. But yeah, it's possible to be like a bit more precise, bringing different kind of materialist histories to bear, like on the region that's being explored through dance.
Yeah, I think there's a series of like fundamental questions raised here about like what is valorized and what isn't, right? And I think if we think about the last century, or even more about debates, sort of Marxist debates about like what constitutes value production and what constitutes something else like social reproduction or even like unwaged work. I mean, there's even the section in Capital where Marx is saying like if you really want to understand how wage servitude works, all you have to do is look at sort of enslaved people in the Americas, which is quite interesting. But that does sort of maintain this dichotomy between value production and sort of like some other form of engagement with sort of the capitalist mode of production. Like you cite this, or not you cite, you actually sort of paraphrase Clyde Woods' argument quite amazingly, where you say that the shift in the mode of production in the U.S. before and after emancipation demonstrates that the relic of the plantation order should be considered part and parcel of a fully agrarian form of capitalism rather than as archaisms of its properly industrial form, right? So I think this is another way of thinking through history, through these two art practices, is how transitions are much less clear-cut than like certain type of modalities and frameworks would have them. And kind of on that point, I wanted to say there's a part in the chapter on Lemon where you sort of you use Lemon's work to shine a light on contemporary debates of Afro-pessimism and social death, which I thought was a really interesting section. You write quite beautifully that Lemon's work with Carter maintains critical negativity and political pessimism without leaving history for ontology or art for aesthetic immediacy. Could you speak a little bit more on this?
Yeah. One reason why I was interested in kind of revisiting that body of literature around Frank Wilderson and around Hartman and Jared Sexton, people like that, was I'd been on a panel with Frank Wilderson, and we were showing his film Reparations Now. And I thought, this is a film about reparations. Cameron Rowland has some work about reparations. Maybe it would be like interesting to try to put these two in conversation and see what he thinks. And then it ended up not actually being such like a fruitful pairing on the panel. But it got me like thinking about maybe why this body of work doesn't necessarily fit easily with this like body of thinking. But yeah, I'd say in general, yeah, it's a little interesting. I maybe add the caveat that this book came out last year, but it was written, the kind of bulk of the writing was done in, say, like 2016, 2017, where I do think maybe the valence of Afro-pessimism as a kind of like as a contemporary modality in like art theory has shifted a little bit. But yeah, I would say this, especially I was in London at the time. It would, I think, be kind of hard to overstate how influential and like exciting this theory felt. What Wilderson was doing, like packed out, standing room only, like multi-day events at ICA London, like that type of thing. So on the one hand, I'd say it was kind of tremendously theoretically productive. I think especially in terms of interventions into the legacy of like Black British cultural studies and like particular readings of Fanon there. And and especially for like young people, I'd say it was like kind of tremendously energetic. But I think obviously there's being theoretically productive and being politically productive are not necessarily the same. And so I was kind of just interested in putting it in conversation with materialist politics and also kind of some of the questions that this theory raises for mass politics, because I do think in different ways, both Rowland and Lemon are like deeply, deeply interested in mass politics. Lemon is kind of constantly turning to the civil rights movement and to, it was like a big multiracial, cross-class, kind of like mass movement, that I think it's the limits are definitely pointed to by, say, Afro-pessimist theory, but I think its real successes and wins and that type of thing are not necessarily, maybe wouldn't be a theory that's the most productive for kind of like understanding like, what's interesting about this movement to, say, Ralph Lemon, which is big, mass, coalitional work. Yeah, and I would also say I do think that there has been a kind of a long, there have been many kind of like Marxist criticisms of Afro-pessimism. I wasn't like interested necessarily in rehearsing those. I think most of the criticisms that I've read have not been so sufficient. I think they're not like imminent criticisms, which would be its own kind of momentous task to produce. I do think somebody should like really take the work more seriously and engage with the most interesting part of it, which is why it is so attractive to so many people, what it animates, like what it's actually produced and enabled. I wasn't so interested in doing that, but I think especially because kind of both Lemon and Roland do draw on Hartman, who sits kind of at the heart of a lot of debates in Black studies. And in some ways one can think of a lot of debates in Black studies as being kind of like battles over the soul of Saidiya Hartman and over Hortense Spillers and a few other figures like that. But yeah, so I was kind of interested in, how to put it, I think there was a tendency to interpret the body of work of both these artists in kind of more, say, metaphysical terms. But I was interested in like the concrete histories that they're addressing, that they're intervening in, and specifically like the types of like contingency that are that I think really kind of become clear as you kind of dig. And so I think especially maybe in Cameron Rowland's work, which we can get into, I do think like specifically the way Rowland kind of is dealing with reparations, I think is maybe much more kind of slippery and ironic than is apparent at first read. And it wasn't something I'd seen any of the work kind of produced a tremendous amount of discourse. It was extremely popular and successful in these types of things, but I did feel that the way in which the work is politically pessimistic, I think is more interesting than it's been given credit for.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your really excellent point, not Afro-pessimist theory itself, which again is not a monolith, and like I think that's also like one mistake that's very often made is that it's arguing one thing, but one perspective on it, particularly from a certain type of Marxist reading, would have it that social death implies some sort of end to politics or some sort of end to history. Right, the sort of like very one-sided reading of Fanon, which focuses mostly on his first book and not on his second book. But I think, the fact that social death can also be a beginning to a different kind of activity, pointing to like youth movements around the world over the last few years that are, I think, very aware of this, if not using those terms. I think there's different modalities of engaging with history that you're pointing to here, and I think Roland's work is perfect in that regard. And I thought it was really interesting that you start the chapter on Roland with a discussion of their use of the ready-made. And in some sense, what you're talking about there with this sort of like productive pessimism, perhaps, we could also consider it like a productive anti-aestheticism. So yeah, could you maybe talk a little bit about how Roland is using the ready-made in a way that engages history in this way?
Yeah, so maybe I'll set up the show a little bit. I think I've glossed it a little bit, but I think the kind of most immediate read of the work is that Roland is doing this old thing, but with a twist. Roland just like making kind of politically charged ready-mades, which is definitely part of it. But I think I'd say like the main gesture is kind of merging the tradition of Duchamp into the tradition of institutional critique. And it's most immediately legible in terms of like second generation institutional critique. And you can think of Fred Wilson or people like that. So I think a lot of readings of the work tended to think that it's somehow about like an aesthetic reframing of these objects. And so you maybe like you pay attention in a new way in the artistic environment to the subtleties of the laminated particle board on a desk produced by inmates at Attica or something like that. But it strikes me that I think what's interesting about the objects is not their aesthetic reframing in the gallery or something, but it is in the very old sense of the ready-made, it is just precisely that they are commodities like other commodities. And I don't read the work as being so much about like ideology critique are consciousness raising, which, if you look at Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum, it's also mobilizing commodities, and it's like specifically manacles from chattel slavery, or silver tea trays, or like these types of things, and like reframing them in the museum in these kind of like almost like theatrical combinations, or really this like staging scenes of like contestation between the stuff that the museum wants you to see and to think about, say, the history of Baltimore, the history of Maryland, and then the stuff that the artist has dragged out from the archive and placed there. So you really have to confront this, the histories that they don't want you to see, the people who they don't want to represent, the audiences who the museum has historically excluded, that type of thing, which was absolutely interesting and utterly compelling at the, in the 90s when, this kind of mode of doing things first appeared. But then I think Roland is very much kind of working in the aftermath of, say, the exhaustion of the ready-made, the exhaustion of certain forms of institutional critique. And I think one thing about the commodity is like not being aestheticized. I think it kind of ratchets up the kind of level at which one has to come to terms with them. Yeah, what's the type of institutional critique that Roland is doing is not really moralizing. Like, one could do a moralizing critique of artist space, and obviously it has a history of quite dubious curation, especially on racial grounds, like these types of things. One could do that type of thing, but I think the things that like artist space is made guilty of in Roland's show is not, it's not necessarily like sociological exclusion or having bad ideology or like these types of things. It's happening at a higher level. It's like, it's just at the level of being an art nonprofit. It's inescapably part of a system in which art nonprofits are kind of just subtended by a sea of like unwaged and are nominally waged and highly coerced labor. And then, so one other piece in the show, disgorgement, which is where the artist has the institution purchase a set of shares in the insurance company Aetna. Aetna is kind of its own moment of primitive accumulation. Is they innovated kind of like maritime financial instruments specifically for insuring ships during the transatlantic slave trade. And so you buy these shares. The shares will accrue value as they do, and then at the moment when there is a federal commission set up to study the dispersal of reparations for descendants of slaves in Americas, then just like the value that's accumulated by the institutions purchasing these shares will be dispersed. It'll go into that general fund, and then whatever the federal government decides to do with it will be done with it. So I think in both these kind of gestures, the institution it's made complicit with, say, the valuation of the dead labor of slaves. It's made complicit with the kind of active super exploitation of incarcerated populations. But it can't really curate itself out of these. It can't get like a new progressive board of directors or do really anything to escape the situation. And I think also with the fact that the commodities are just commodities, like other ones, they all kind of point to a total social system. So if you look at the fire jackets, these are jackets that are worn by prisoners who are, one of the jobs you can do as a prisoner in California is you can fight wildfires. So in that sense, they kind of, they point outward toward basic safety provisions, toward ecological catastrophe. The manhole covers point to, they're used for leveling roads. Roads are obviously essential for the circulation of people, the circulation of goods. There are these lashing bars that are used to hold shipping containers in place on ships, and which also point outward to just like general global commodity production, circulation. So all these, it's kind of like or also the desks point to just they're just desks used by government agencies or by art nonprofits, and they kind of like point out to how these are all also subtended by like all bureaucracy, all kind of like general state provisions, good and bad, like all aspects of our lives are kind of just like subtended by this base level of super exploitation, which historically one can trace to the transatlantic slave trade. So I do think it's like the level of complicity or something it's at such a high level that there's not like a way out for anybody. And so what Roland does is kind of just like go further into it, just like makes the institution buy the shares, makes them register with core services or whoever's provisioning these the prison-made commodities.
This point about moralizing is really interesting because, as you're saying, what kind of Roland is doing is using this nonprofit as a tool to demonstrate the technologies of incarceration, right? So if we think with like Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Prison Fix, we think about how the nature of contemporary racialized capitalism is not just doing this because it is fundamentally racist, though it is, but it's because it's fundamentally necessary to the accumulation of capital in the current sort of conjuncture, we could say, or something like that. Which is, I think, really well put. And this comparison with Fred Wilson is also quite interesting because with Wilson's work, at least the works that I'm familiar with, it is doing a little bit of consciousness raising in the sense that it's demonstrating to people who might still harbor this notion that art is fundamentally other to labor or fundamentally other to, or let's say aesthetics, or fundamentally other to the capitalist mode of production, that in fact all of these museum holdings were intimately interrelated with first the slave trade and then sort of like post-emancipation, Jim Crow and things like this. So I guess maybe as a final question to bring the two artists' work together and also your incredibly incisive writing on them, you write at the very end in the conclusion that for both artists, art's uselessness becomes a point through which it articulates social insight, a means for considering the ex-slave, the prison slave, and the wage slave as they each shape the meaning of the past, which I think is a really demonstrative way of bringing these two, let's say, anti-aesthetic practices together. So yeah, could you maybe speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So I think that they both are artists who are really attentive to the question of like art's uselessness. They both are making very politically charged work, specifically like political histories they're both drawing on, but I think they're also very clear-eyed about what art is and its role. I think for neither artist is art ersatz politics. So in a way, Lemon plays on art's uselessness as doing what like Walter de Maria would call like meaningless work. So he has Walter who, whose whole life as a sharecropper was doing extremely arduous, like backbreaking manual labor. He has Walter do like silly, absurdist, like kind of Fluxus games for the most part, which Walter sometimes does, sometimes refuses to do, like all these types of things. But so I think that's I think one way in which Lemon kind of brings the theme of like art's like own uselessness and kind of like liberating Walter's own kind of like labor from use or from production, I think is like a big theme in that, even as he's kind of thematizing whether his own whether paying Walter to do these things is its own kind of form of exploitation becomes like a question that he's kind of like relentlessly self-doubting, relentlessly critical. So yeah, I think it's one that Lemon kind of dramatizes uselessness in that way. I think Roland also does so just by drawing on the ready-made, which is kind of the useless work of art par excellence. Lemon is especially interesting because on the one hand, I think more than I would say almost any other living artist in terms of ratcheting up the stakes of what social practice is and the movement of art into life, or the idea that art could provide any type of like meaningfully try to address any of the plethora of social crises that communities find themselves in. I do think disgorgement is like a real innovation in the form of that, because it's like a non-voluntaristic form of doing social practice. You don't have to recruit an audience to participate in your like long study and then to do the thing that's going to have the kind of like charitable effects or something. It's just it's simply the institution buys the shares accumulate value, and then when the historical condition presents itself, when this bill that is kind of brought before legislature every year, when it finally comes to pass that there is a committee formed to disperse reparations, then the work just goes, it simply does provide money to the descendants of slaves. It's direct, it's automatic, it's also totally like bureaucratic. It's not really consciousness raising, it's not creating some type of like a convivial artistic community or anything like that, but it is kind of going into the world in like a meaningful, direct and material way. But on the other hand, I do think there's something sober and also I think a bit funny about it. That work is I pair it with another piece in the show titled National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Associations badges, which is the only kind of like archival work in the show. It's these two pot brass badges that are like a crescent moon and a star, and they were worn by members in a mutual aid society that, people, ex-slaves, as the Freedmen's Bureau was scuttled, kind of got together, grouped their funds together, and they were kind of like raising money, both like give pensions for each other, but also raising money to help to do a legislative campaign, which would establish at a federal level basically a committee to disperse reparations. So you have these two works. You have this like very humble, like, a kind of small mutual aid society of people just getting together, getting their money to try to get this legislation passed. It didn't pass. There were the politicians who they were giving their money to swindled them. The money was taken. There, like, no meaningful legislative campaign was mounted. So you have that on the one hand, and then you have the other piece of legislation that continues to get brought to Congress by a congressman from Detroit. It's for many, many years. It's been brought every single year. It gets voted down. And I think it's kind of like the relay between these two things is like one's like a mutual aid society. It's very kind of community based. The other is just like cold, hard bureaucracy administration. And it also, it is, should it come to pass, it will do a very real type of politics. But like the actual political reality is that it's like, it's kind of a non-starter. There's like, there doesn't seem to be any immediate situation in which this changes at a federal level and we get this type of like transformative legislation. So they both end up being some way these kind of like doomed kind of utopian gestures, but also I think it's like on the one hand extremely practical, on the other hand like an extreme example of like art's uselessness in the context of the capitalist system in the United States. So yeah, I think it's but in kind of both of these they're artists who are like really engaging with like real world politics, but then I think they are also just like very just clear about it's like a renegotiation of say like arts autonomy or something like that. It's like the work is demonstrating its own kind of failure to be anything more than a work of art. And I think it's playing up those limits that makes them really attractive. I think it's like setting kind of like a new like high watermark for how artists should be negotiating the way that like art engages with politics or does politics or thinks about kind of like concrete political conjunctures, but then they also they don't kind of like inflate themselves as like themselves being the things that will transform the world or change the world. And I do think there's some tendencies now, especially among like artists who engage political radicalism to behave as though the work itself is doing politics or engages politics. And I think we've seen this kind of recently with like Strike Germany, where there's obviously a big kind of cultural boycott of German institutions because of the German state's like repression of like speech around the genocide in Gaza. And artists will like my work is itself the protest. My work is itself, this is like its own form of political suppression by like making these types of things. I do think there is like, if one kind of isn't really attentive to the fact of like art's real limits, like art's dialectical autonomy. Yeah, there is a way in which like it leads one to like I think both bad thinking about art and also bad thinking about politics. And so I think both of these artists are really demonstrate how to do like extremely incisive kind of like social work while also illuminating the boundedness of everything.
Well, Ciarán, thanks so much for coming by and for speaking with me today. We were discussing his exceptional new book, Perpetual Slavery, out with Floating Opera Press in 2023.
Thank you.